The morning sun broke through the moss-draped oaks of Savannah, spilling gold across the cobblestone driveway of the Whitmore estate. From a distance, the mansion looked eternal, its tall white columns and polished steps catching the early light. Inside, everything was order, silence, and inherited pride. Charles Whitmore sat at the head of the long mahogany table in his breakfast room, the Savannah Tribune folded neatly beside his untouched coffee. Across from him sat his only son, David, his fingers tapping nervously against his cup. Between them stretched, more than linen, and silverware. It was the thick air of expectation. "You'll attend the investors' luncheon today," Charles said without looking up. "They expect the future CEO to show his face." David hesitated. "I can't, Father. I promised Elena I'd help her set up for the art show downtown." That was the moment it began, the unraveling of the name Whitmore. Charles lifted his gaze, slowly, his gray eyes narrowing. "You mean the painter?" David nodded. "Yes, she's a distraction." Charles's voice cut through the air. "That girl doesn't belong in your world. She has nothing to offer you." "She has everything that matters," David said quietly. Charles leaned back in his chair. "You're a Whitmore. That name means something in Savannah. It was built on generations of discipline, not emotions." David stared at him. "What's the point of a name if it costs you your soul?" Charles slammed his palm on the table. "Enough. You will end this foolishness." But David didn't end it. He walked out of the house that day and into the humid streets of Savannah, where art, laughter, and Elena Cruz waited. She was a Cuban-American artist who painted with her heart. Bright colors, open hands, and no fear of being small. Her world smelled of turpentine, rain, and hope. David found something in her that money had never given him: belonging. They married quietly at the courthouse with no family present. Only 2 witnesses and a promise that love would be enough. When Charles heard, he disowned him without hesitation. The words came in a single letter, neatly typed on Whitmore letterhead. "You've chosen a life beneath your name. Consider this your freedom and your severance." David didn't respond. He sold his car, left his father's estate keys in the mail, and moved with Elena into a small apartment above her studio. Those early years were hard but full. They painted walls together, shared grilled cheese dinners, and built dreams that fit within the size of their love. Elena's art began to sell, slowly. David started a small design firm, Cruz and Whitmore Studio, blending his architectural knowledge with her artistry. They didn't have much, but they had peace. Across town, Charles carried on as though his son had died. The mansion remained immaculate. The Whitmore name still appeared on buildings and business cards. Yet every night, as he sat in his study staring at the portrait of his late wife, he felt the echo of footsteps that no longer came home. And though he would never admit it, the silence of the house began to sound like punishment. 15 years later, the Whitmore name still gleamed, but its shine was fading. The world had changed. Technology ruled, old businesses crumbled, and younger companies were reshaping Savannah's skyline. Whitmore Holdings, once a symbol of unshakable prestige, was beginning to totter. Contracts stalled, investors pulled out, and the boardroom, once full of laughter and champagne, now echoed with quiet worry. Charles Whitmore still believed in the power of legacy. "We've survived recessions, wars, and government changes," he told his directors. "We'll survive this, too." But he couldn't see the truth that he had built an empire on pride, not adaptability. Every morning, he still arrived at his office in a black Cadillac, dressed in pressed suits and silver cufflinks, but inside he was a man watching his world shrink. His phone calls went unanswered. His investors stopped returning messages. The empire was bleeding quietly and no one could stop it. One morning, his longtime assistant, Grace Holloway, entered his office with a heavy folder. She had worked for him for over 20 years, loyal, wise, and unafraid to speak truth. "Sir," she said gently, The bank sent another notice. If we don't restructure within 60 days, they'll seize the riverside properties. Charles adjusted his glasses, scanning the numbers as though they were lies. We'll sell the lesser assets. The press will never know. Grace shook her head. It's not enough. We're beyond asset sales. We need innovation, a new strategy, someone who understands modern architecture and branding. He scoffed. Branding? We build buildings, not billboards. Whitmore doesn't play with slogans. Grace took a breath. Then maybe we need someone who knows how to speak to the world as it is, not as it was. Charles frowned, irritation rising. Who do you have in mind? She hesitated. Your son. The words landed like a stone thrown through glass. My son. His voice tightened. The one who abandoned his name? No, she replied quietly. The one you abandoned. Charles's face hardened. He walked away from everything I built. Grace didn't flinch. Maybe he just wanted to build something of his own. She placed a printed article on his desk. It was from a business magazine. Cruz and Whitmore Studio, the small Savannah firm redefining design for a new generation. The photo showed David standing beside a colorful mural, hand in hand with Elena. Behind them, a team of young designers smiled proudly. They've created community projects across Savannah, Grace explained. Affordable housing with artistic elements, small parks, local art spaces. People love them. They're what Whitmore Holdings used to be. Trusted. Charles turned away, staring out the window at the Savannah River glinting beneath the afternoon sun. I don't need his charity. Grace sighed. You need his heart. That night, the mansion felt emptier than ever. Charles poured himself a glass of scotch and sat beneath the chandelier, his reflection trembling in the crystal. The portrait of his late wife watched over him. Are you proud of me, Marianne? He whispered. I kept the name alive. But even as he said it, he heard the lie. What was the use of a name if no one shared it with you? In his dreams, he saw David again, a boy of 10, standing at the riverbank, holding a wooden model of a house. Someday I'll build homes for people, Dad. Ones where they feel safe. He woke with a jolt. The glass knocked from his hand. The room smelled of stale pride and loneliness. At dawn, he sat at his desk, took a sheet of company letterhead, and wrote one line in trembling script. If the Whitmore name ever meant anything to you, come home. He signed it, folded it, and gave it to Grace. Deliver this yourself, he said quietly. When Grace arrived at Cruz and Whitmore Studio, she found David crouched on the floor with his 3-year-old daughter, Isabella, building towers of wooden blocks. Elena was painting by the window, her dress speckled with color, sunlight warming her curls. The room smelled of coffee and turpentine, alive, imperfect, full of love. Grace smiled softly. You look happy here. David stood, dusting his hands. We are. She handed him the envelope. Your father asked me to give you this. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting, sharp yet fragile, sent a current through his chest. Elena came closer. You don't have to read it, she said softly. I already did, he murmured, scanning the single sentence. She looked at him, anxious. Are you thinking of going? David exhaled slowly. Maybe. Not because I owe him, but because I owe it to myself to see what's left. That evening, after Elena and Isabella went to sleep, he drove toward the bridge overlooking the Savannah River. The water shimmered beneath the moon, the same river he'd once crossed in his father's boat as a boy. He leaned on the railing, the letter in his hand, and whispered to the night, If you meant it, Dad, I'm coming home. The Whitmore boardroom hadn't changed. The same mahogany table stretched across the polished floor. The same oil portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls. But when David Whitmore walked in after 15 years, the air felt different, colder, heavier. His father stood near the window, looking out over the city he once commanded. The morning light traced the outline of an older man, shoulders slightly bent, hair grayer, but still proud. Charles turned slowly. You came. David placed the letter on the table. You asked. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant buzz of construction outside. Charles gestured to a chair. Sit. I'd rather stand, David replied. Charles sighed and poured coffee into 2 cups, his hand trembling slightly. The company's in trouble. The board wants new leadership. Investors are panicking. I built this empire to last, but it's slipping. David studied his father carefully. You built it on control, not on people. That's why it's falling. Charles's jaw tightened. You think you know better? You left. I left because you made it impossible to stay, David said evenly. But I didn't stop building. I learned that real foundations aren't made of concrete. They're made of connection. The old man looked down. Connection doesn't pay bills. Neither does pride, David replied. They stood in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, Charles said, Can you help me fix it? David hesitated. The boy in him still wanted to shout no, to let the empire crumble as punishment. But the man in him, the father, the husband, the son who had learned grace from Elena's gentle heart, found different words. I'll help, he said, but not for the company, for the people who work here. And for Mom. She'd want that. Something softened in Charles's eyes. You sound like her. The next weeks were long and full of tension. David moved through the offices like a quiet storm. He introduced digital design tools, streamlined outdated projects, and convinced the board to rebrand the firm. Under his guidance, Whitmore Holdings became Whitmore and Company, a new foundation. He insisted on new partnerships with community-based projects and younger architects. We don't just build buildings, he said in a meeting. We build trust. The employees began to smile again. Investors returned. For the first time in years, the company felt alive. Charles watched from his glass office, torn between pride and guilt. One night, he walked into David's workspace and found him sketching a design. A mixed-use building combining affordable housing with an art gallery. Charles peered over his shoulder. What's that? David smiled faintly. A project your company rejected 10 years ago. Elena painted the concept. It was supposed to bring art into low-income neighborhoods. His father frowned. It wasn't profitable. It's priceless, David said simply. It builds community. Charles stared at the design for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he said, I was wrong about her, about you. David looked up but said nothing. Charles cleared his throat. When I disowned you, I told myself it was for your good. I thought protecting our name was the same as protecting you, but all I did was destroy both. David closed his sketchbook. It's not too late to rebuild either one. Weeks later, the company's future was finally secure. The restructuring was approved. Whitmore and Company had new investors and renewed trust. On the morning the deal was finalized, Charles sat in his office, staring at a framed photograph of his wife. We did it, Marianne, he whispered, but not because of me. When David entered, Charles rose unsteadily. It's done, David said. The company's safe. Charles nodded, his eyes glistening. You saved it. We saved it, David corrected. The old man's voice cracked. You could have walked away again, but you didn't. David smiled softly. Sometimes walking away isn't strength. Sometimes forgiveness is. Charles swallowed hard. I don't deserve it. Maybe not, David said, but I'm giving it anyway. The words broke something in Charles. He stepped forward, his voice trembling. I spent my life building towers, David, but you built bridges. Can you ever forgive me for tearing ours down? David hesitated, then nodded slowly. I already have. For the first time in 15 years, father and son embraced, awkwardly, painfully, honestly. That weekend, Charles visited David's modest home in the heart of Savannah. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with laughter and children's bikes leaning against fences. Elena opened the door, graceful and calm, wearing paint on her hands and warmth in her smile. "Mr. Whitmore," she greeted softly. He hesitated. "Call me Charles." Inside, little Isabella sat at the dining table, painting on a large sheet of paper. She looked up, her brown eyes bright. "Hi, Grandpa." Charles froze. "You know who I am?" She giggled. "Daddy told me you used to build big buildings, but now we're building something smaller, a painting." She held up a brush dripping with blue paint. "Help me." Charles chuckled, the sound rusty and new. "I'd like that." He knelt beside her, dipping the brush into the paint, his cufflinks catching a bit of color. Elena watched quietly from across the room, the man who once called her unworthy now laughing beside his granddaughter. Later that evening, as the sky turned pink over the marshlands, the family sat on the porch sipping lemonade. The air smelled of jasmine and forgiveness. Charles leaned back in his chair, looking at his son. "I used to think legacy meant keeping the name alive," he said. "But now I know it means keeping the people alive who carry it." David smiled. "Then you finally built the right thing." The old man nodded slowly. "I didn't just sell the family name, did I? I almost sold the family itself." "But you bought it back," David replied, with humility. As the sun sank over Savannah, Charles looked out at his son, his daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter, 3 hearts he had once lost and now found again. And for the first time in his long life, he felt that the name Whitmore finally meant something worth keeping. Thanks for watching.